My name is Lynn Wells, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the 14th Annual StarTIDES Capability Demonstration. I'm very pleased our guest today is Dr. Sheila Ronis. Sheila is Professor of Management at Walsh College, and she also directs the Center for Complex and Strategic Decisions there. In addition, she has a joint appointment with the Argonne National Laboratory in Chicago. She'll be talking today about strategic thinking and foresight. But first, I'd like to invite her to say a little bit more about herself. Sheila?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sheila Ronis, and I am a systems scientist who specializes in complex, large systems, especially social systems and their behavior. I teach at a couple different schools, and mainly I'm a strategic foresight practitioner for the military intelligence community in the United States.
Thank you.
So
we want to talk today about foresight and systems thinking, and in particular, so how foresight may be used to anticipate what sustainable resilience might look like in this era of converging, accelerating forces. So your thoughts on that, please.
Okay, well, it's a big question, and I'll give you a few different approaches. As you know, the use of strategic foresight has lots of different tools in their toolbox, and probably the best one to do anticipatory governance or to anticipate the study of complex systems might be the use of scenarios, which is a tool that I've used a great deal over the last several years. In particular, something that I've called a visionario, which is really a 360-degree look at a situation where you try to identify as many elements in the system as you can, and you look at their interdependencies and interactions, and you try and anticipate different things that can happen to that system so that you can think through what the messiness is, or as Dr. Akoff would say, the messiness of the system. And you think about all the different interactions that can happen. Even if you don't identify them all, you will learn a great deal about that system. And the more you learn about the system, the more likely you are to be successful in that system or trying to affect change in that system. So I think the best anticipatory tool that we have is probably the development of scenarios. And the more you look at a system that is complex, it's even easier and better to explore situations in the system by thinking about them before they occur so that you can learn from them and be much more prepared to help the system when the time comes.
So can you give some examples of where this is being used effectively today?
Well, I think perhaps in the U.S. military, certainly in the Army, it has been used extensively, but it has been used on the Joint Staff, and in the United States, it's mainly used in the military intelligence community, but in other countries, it's much more effectively used across their entire governments, such as Finland or Singapore, where it's very common for them to develop scenarios and then plan whole of government solution sets to address specific issues.
So for example, what would be a good example of a scenario? When you say scenario, what do you actually mean by scenario?
A scenario is a story, and it tries to, in the scenarios I develop, that I call visionarios, I try to look at the systemic nature of what I'm examining, so that in the story, I will have storylines that impact all these different elements, but most importantly, not just looking at the elements, but their interactions and interdependencies and how one thing will interface another thing so that you may have cascading effects that you otherwise wouldn't anticipate. In the Project on National Security Reform, for example, in our Red Death pandemic scenario, we anticipated many of the unfortunate situations that we are wrestling with today in our society. Unfortunately, a lot of people didn't take those scenarios very seriously because they thought they were just intellectual exercises. But in reality, if we had more effectively prepared based on those scenarios, and in fact had made the changes that the project suggested to Congress, we would have been far better off in anticipating and then delivering the kinds of services that the people of the United States need.
So that's actually a great, if unfortunate, example. I'm wondering, we know that places like Singapore do very well with scenario planning. What's an example of a successful use of scenario planning in the US? Because one of the things we found over time is that there have been a number of exceptionally good anticipatory governance plans that have been put together, only to see the practitioners, either in a different administration or a different time frame, whatever, not follow through with them. And so I guess one of the questions is, how do you then link the exceptionally good planning that goes into some of these with the encourage the practitioners to follow up on it?
Yeah, I wish there were a better answer to that, but I don't really have one. I think that the United States can be very political, and sometimes the best solution sets require that scientists lead the way and experts lead the way and not politicians. But the reality is that whole communities can use the same kinds of technologies to at least improve the situation in their local area, if they so choose. And that just requires some local leadership to pull people together as a community and say, you know, if this happens, well, these 5 townships are all going to share resources and we're going to work together to solve the problem. It isn't an impossible task, but it does require leadership. And leadership frequently is what's missing, because either it's too difficult or too political to overcome. But if you can overcome it, it's a very powerful tool. And we have seen other countries, be successful at doing this. So we know there is evidence that it works if you have the leadership and the political commitment to do it.
So let's turn now to the way this might be, systems thinking and foresight might be used in the StarTIDES context. One of the things about StarTIDES is that it looks at integrating platforms in support of different community-based objectives, typically. And so, for example, in one community, we were asked to look at integrating clean water with the things that they said they needed. You know, first of all, StarTIDES always starts with listening. So one of the things they said they needed was clean water. The next was high energy efficiency, low cost shelters, because they lived in trailers and things, cheap to buy, impossible to heat. And then they needed broadband to keep the young people there. And so we had some students who looked at that, and they did some very good system engineering analysis. But if you then go back to the community with sort of complex engineering solutions and things like that, then you're not going to sort of convince the community. You have to go back and talk to them in their language, their resources, and their values. So how do you translate this system engineering thinking analysis into the narratives that would fit with different community values and this sort of thing?
Probably the most important thing to do is to tell a story, and a story that they can understand. You know, if the power grid goes down and you have these locally generated capabilities, your power doesn't go down, and you can continue to meet the needs of people. I think what's really so exciting to me about TIDES is that, in fact, it is both it takes a lot of complexity out of the system by providing local solution sets that are distributed, and it's that distribution that takes some complexity out of the problems of local communities. If the United States, for example, had a distributed energy grid, which it does not, it is very centralized in just a few major grids, you would find that our resiliency would be much higher. Our ability to return to functionality when we have a system failure would be improved. And I think it's that kind of thinking that would be that's just so helpful to communities, because they are really protected. And the more they have, groups of TIDES capabilities in their communities, the more protected they are from large-scale system failure, which can occur because they have not been built in resilient ways. And your systems are resilient. Did that answer that question a bit?
Sure. Well, so the community focus is very important. And one of the principles of listening, learning, and lasting is, in addition to listening to what the community is trying to tell us, when you engage, you want not only to perhaps teach some things to the community, but also to learn lessons that could be applied more generally elsewhere. So if you take a bottom-up community level-led approach, you can get very good, as you point out, systems thinking about the problems at the community level. But how does that scale? How can you take, this is the optimal community for the optimal solution for Peoria. And then how does that extend to the whole state, and then extend to some portion of the entire Northeast grid or Northeast interconnect or something like that?
Well, again, I would tell a story about why something worked in a community and what the lessons were that you got from that. And I would then try and encourage other communities to look at those solutions. And with an understanding that they need to learn their vulnerabilities and the ways in which these really help to overcome those vulnerabilities. And I would tell stories. I mean, that's the scalability issue is an interesting one, because it seriously examines the fact that a lot of resilient systems can simply be duplicated in multiple places, and soon you have an incredibly resilient system because everything is distributed. It's small scale. So if one community goes down, the entire northeast of the United States does not go down. And it's that kind of thinking that most people just don't have, because they don't see it. They aren't told about it. And I think the more you communicate what the reality is of much of our critical infrastructure, the more likely you will have the political will to do something about it. Did that answer the question?
So then how do we, I'm thinking now in terms of training and education. So it's one thing to educate system engineers, and it's one thing to educate political scientists, and it's one thing to perhaps—
We don't talk to each other.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm thinking now in the educational realm. So what kind of courses, what kind of certificates, what kind of workshops would best get to the goals that you're talking about?
Well, if you're really looking at university level, the more interdisciplinary your approaches are, the better, because very few real world complex problems, or problems that are reflective of complex systems, I should say, have simple answers. They have interdisciplinary approaches that can ameliorate whatever problem you're looking at. But unless you have people who have a broad view of the system, they may not see the linkages that exist, and they won't know how to make those linkages that can, in fact, provide the kinds of critical infrastructure that all societies need. And the more likely they are to have experienced multiple points of view and multiple lenses and multiple filters to look at problems, the more likely you're going to have real world solutions that work.
So one of the core issues here is, as Tom Friedman has talked about, we're in an era of accelerations, and the fourth industrial revolution talks about converging forces, blurring the lines between the physical, the digital, and the biological worlds. And so the complexity of the complex problems and the interdependencies are only growing. And so
correct.
One of the things the new Center for Resilient and Sustainable Communities, CRASC, that George Mason was stood up to be, was a transdisciplinary center. And the point was not just to be multidisciplinary, but actually to generate new knowledge based on bringing these different disciplines together. So it's not just you talk to the energy people and talk to the water people, talk to the power people and integrate, but collectively they generate new knowledge. And so in the courses you've taught and the schools you've been at, have you seen examples of where that's worked and what some of the outcomes are?
That's a real loaded question. In most of the colleges I've had experience with, there have been many attempts to do this in an academic way. They have not all been successful because of the nature of academia, but not in the nature of making a difference in the world. And the more applied the faculty are in those schools, the more successful they tend to be. Because if your objective and your entire being is to try and get tenure, and you have 4 journals that you're allowed to publish in, and if you stray from that, which many of these complex issues in society would require you to do, then you're going to be negatively reinforced. But if you say, I don't care about tenure, I want to help make the world a better place, you are much more likely to be able to make the world a better place and apply your knowledge and create new knowledge in that process. Academia hasn't caught up, though. I applaud George Mason in attempting to do this, because it is really the Lord's work.
I was really impressed some years ago by Michael Crow, the president of Arizona State, who was looking to move the school to more transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary areas. And he had set up things like the Biodesign Center and the Center for Synthetic Biology. And someone pointed out that that must generate concerns among your traditional academic departments, which, and he said,
Yes.
well, this way, I have something like 23 department chairs. I've replaced 21. And I have a search underway for the 22nd. And so it does take that, really radical thinking.
And leadership who's willing to make, to make difference, to make a change. So, yes.
Well, so this is compounded by the fact that you mentioned complex problems. So before we go into the next question, tell us a little bit about wicked or complex problems and what characterizes them?
Well, one of the most important characteristics from my perspective is you can't control a complex system. You can influence it, and you can, you certainly, the more you understand it, the more likely you'll be successful at influencing it. But you really can't predict how it's going to behave, and you can't directly control it, at least not without a tremendous amount of energy or resources. And even then, you can probably only control it for a little bit, and then it'll go off and do its own thing. I think what's critical to understand is that it also, complex systems exhibit something called emergence, which is they have properties that just come into being almost spontaneously. At least it feels like it's spontaneous. And it can self-organize if it's a social system. And there are many, the issues related to complex systems and resilient systems, or systems that are trying to be resilient within a complex system, is that there are tremendous challenges with this issue of not being able to control or predict. But it also enables enormous opportunities because of the characteristic of emergence, which is things can come together and find a way to adapt quickly to changes within the system. And that's another reason that StarTIDES is so potentially valuable, not just for the communities that they are developing in, but for lessons that societies can take on a broader scale.
So when you say resilience, what do you mean by resilience?
My definition of resilience is a characteristic that when a system loses its functionality, it can return to functionality. Doesn't have to be the same functionality, but it does have to be functionality. So if you lose your power, for example, when the system recovers and people have power again, it has exhibited resilience, so to speak. But it doesn't have to necessarily be that, the grid has come back up. It could be that every single entity in the system now has its own power generator, so to speak, or solar cells or solar panels on their rooftops, and there's a wind generator, and there are multiple other ways that the community has power again. It does not have to be the same exact approach. It can be a different approach. As long as the power comes back, that's what matters.
Got it. So let's talk then about this iterative nature of solutions to complex or wicked problems, and why do they tend not to be something you can just solve?
Well, I think because in a complex system, cause-effect relationships are not always direct functions. In a linear world where cause and effect are directly correlated, it is usually fairly simple to develop solution sets. But in a world where the cause-effect relationship is broken, or there is no link at all, there are lots of different problem sets associated with trying to take a linear approach and putting them into a nonlinear world. They just simply don't work. And I think for that reason, it's important to completely rethink what it means in a nonlinear environment. And complex systems are, that's why they're messy.
So realistically, I mean, I don't disagree with anything you've said, but realistically, this is a very daunting challenge for governance. of how you take people who are
Yes.
by and large not steeped in these kind of thought processes, but who are affected by the outcomes of these complex adaptive systems where, you know, global solutions can impact you, in many ways. So how do you bear that? How do you translate what you're talking about into governance?
The best way I've learned how to do that is to illustrate things through stories of people and the situation, put them into very tough situations and then show them possible solution sets. Sometimes, one of the issues of solving, if you call it solving complex problems, is that you have to start with an understanding that you may not be able to solve the problem, but that doesn't mean you can't ameliorate the situation in the complex system. Because solving tends to imply, first of all, that there is a solution, and there may not be a solution. In order to get to the kinds of functionality you need, you may need multiple solutions and in many different kinds of forms. Like my energy analogy, where if the grid goes down, the only way to be successful in bringing it back up may not be to try and bring it back up, but to in fact deliver energy in different ways and in multiple ways to ultimately get to a more resilient system that won't go down when a large, huge grid goes down, and to solve problems in a more distributed way.
Got it. So if you are dealing with a young person, today, what do you encourage them to learn about all this? Let's say of two different types of people. One is a technical person, a system engineering student, but the other is like a political science person, or someone who wants to do good in the world, but they need to know something about these complicated issues. At the same time, the system engineering student needs to know something about coupling their analysis back into the real world. So how would you talk to those students?
I like to encourage students to do, all students, to do a couple different things. At the university level, I like them to take, if they have a few electives, they should take electives in areas that they don't generally take electives in. I think all engineering students need to take some kinds of social science. They need to understand social phenomena. And I think, and of course that's easy for me to say, I was a physics major, and then I got social science degrees in my graduate work, and vice versa. I think that, every political science or English major or history major needs to take some science-based courses, even if it's just at the freshman level, but they need to understand data. They need to understand at least a semblance of mathematics to be literate from my perspective. However,
Wrap this up then, and thank you so much for this. But the question is, you're a businessman or woman.
Well, I'm more of an academic today, but yes, I was a business person for years and years and years.
Right, and so how do they? They have to demonstrate returns on investment. They've got to be justifying what they're doing to stakeholders, and they're doing this against a background that is almost impossible to explain. So how do you, as a business leader, both motivate your subordinates and also explain to your stakeholders how you are operating in this world?
Well, I think the most important thing to do is the right thing first, because first of all, employees tend to be very happy when they know that they're working for an organization that cares and that does want to make a difference in the world, and not just a profit. You know, I had the great privilege of working with Dr. Deming as a colleague and a mentor. And he said, you know, there's only one reason for businesses to be in business. And you may think it's to make shareholders filthy rich, but it isn't. It's to provide jobs for a society, because with jobs, everything else will come in due time. And I think that in many respects, he was right. All organizations need to understand their principles and their values, because that will drive ultimately to profits. And if they keep that in mind, they can't go too far wrong, because they're going to have satisfied employees, satisfied customers, and everything else just comes naturally after that.
Sheila, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm sure our audience has appreciated your insights also. And we look forward to many further complex and adaptive interactions going forward.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Lynn. Take care.
Bye-bye.